Hi, this is Alexandra Kitty. Welcome to Clue IQ Chronicles, Crime, Code, and Clues. Today I'm going to be talking about the latest game that's come out called Secrets Beyond the Grave. This game has a longer history than A Victim's Matter. This was originally purposed as a true crime TV show, and eventually I switched over to making it interactive documentary, or what we call a game. So this was an idea I had while I was working on A Time to Kill. Because one of the cases I was working on was actually the case that I'm working with the premiere episode here for Secrets Beyond the Grave. And what was fascinating was noting when victims have a secret life that nobody knows about until they're murdered. And sometimes it has everything to do with their death. Sometimes it was just a link in the chain. And sometimes it has nothing to do with it. They had a secret life, but the death had nothing to do with their secret. So I said, this is interesting. I gathered enough cases to actually have a series. They would come from all over the world. People who were secret preachers, secret drug runners, people who had secret children, secret identities. So I thought, why not look at this? So this is something that's been a labor of love for me. And that's how Secrets Beyond the Grave started. So this episode takes place in Canada, and it's the murder of a elderly woman and her mentally unstable nephew. So this is a real life crime. And I really enjoyed researching this when I was working in television. But I said, the angle, the point of view was standard for a true crime show, and I wanted a different angle. And this is what I came up. So this is actually a historical mystery. And I'll tell you a little bit about the background of this case. So you had two people that were related, Elsie Steppa and Harry Jones. And Harry was the nephew, the 52-year-old nephew of poor Elsie Steppa. So they moved to Ethelbert, Manitoba, which is a town with barely 300 people. And they came and they were considered oddballs. Harry would yell and was very antagonistic and very aggressive. He had a couple of aggressive dogs. He was very controlling. Elsie was very easygoing and a little bit too easygoing and very intimidated by Harry. And then one day, neighbors noticed there was no smoke coming out of the roof of their house because they had a fireplace because they didn't have electricity. If you know anything about Manitoba, it's minus 40-degree weather in the winter. So not having electricity in your house because your nephew, who thinks he is the Messiah, quite literally, decrees that you don't need it, is quite the challenge. So there was a wellness check. And when the police came, they came up with a very gruesome sight of what happened to poor Elsie. It was definitely not an end she deserved. And then the first suspect, of course, was Harry. So when you play the game or immerse yourself in this documentary, you're going to find out a lot of twists and turns. This is not a typical homicide. There's tragic elements, not just in the traditional sense of people were murdered, but people's whose lives were made worse because there was nobody in this small town to help them. So when the secret of one of these victims comes out, we can see why they insulated themselves, but this town did not really understand what these two people needed, and they didn't have resources. So this is a case that has multiple layers. And there were a lot of research hurdles because this takes place in Canada, and files are not handled the same in Canada than they are in the US. This is why you have a lot more true crime episodes in the US. And you'll notice that they tend to gravitate toward Florida, Texas, and Ohio. So if you're a fan of true crime, you'll notice this. And there's a reason for it. It's the ease of gaining information. The cost, the ease, the speed. and the chances of you getting a yay over a nay. So this was a challenge to do because I couldn't use what I used on the program. I had to use from different sources. So this is a little different than the episode I worked. So how do you research something that you're not using the same sources you did when you were very thorough in your work? So that was a challenge. But it wasn't the only challenge, and it was a fun challenge. I won't say it was hair-pulling. Designing an interactive narrative around this unusual story. So how do you translate this to a documentary? Because when I pitched this idea to the producers, nobody ever did a documentary on this case. So you'll also notice through podcasts and true crime TV, there tends to be a lot of overlap of the cases they cover, and there's usually a reason for it. You watch other true crime shows to see which detectives are willing to talk on camera, which assets are the easiest to get. So that's why you have a lot of overlap, everybody doing the same cases. So nobody had done this one before. It was, when I did it for A Time to Kill, it was a bunch of hurdles, but I managed to overcome them all. And the final episode is something I'm very, very proud of. But when you're doing it in an interactive and immersive documentary, as opposed to a television infotainment documentary, it's not the same. You need to branch, you need to add immersion, and you need to add empathy. So it's not just, the slab of the week. And that's one problem I had with working with true crime, is that victims are not really seen as much more than cannon fodder with a really nice smile that lights up a room where they enter. That's about it. This is a very nice person. They were very nice to their pet doggy, and then they got killed. Now let's focus on who did it. Who's the killer? And I have problems with. So how do you branch out a story with the focus on the victims as people? So there's pivotal scenes in this, and I don't want to give anything away. If you are interested, play the game. It's on itch.io. But how do you tell this story where it doesn't turn into a farce for insensitive people? So when you're mapping out branches, you want people to reach different conclusions. So there's good endings, bittersweet endings, bad endings. But how do you reach a bad ending? What is it that the player does that reaches a bad ending? Because usually when we're doing mystery or detective games in fiction, it's usually missing a clue or asking a wrong question. It tends to be very much analytical. And here I wanted something more emotional. There's something in your emotional toolkit that needs to be sharpened or recalibrated. So that was the challenge going in. How does the player learn how to look outside, but also how to look within themselves, which was made easier when you add AI and empathy into the gameplay. So AI really can help and support deeper storytelling to the point where you would think this be taking off by now. AI gets a bad rap from creatives who don't really understand the mechanics of what this can do. And it can do an awful lot. It can guide, it can give feedback, it can add context and nuance that a traditional game cannot. So you input, you can have 2 or 3 decisions, or you can move left or right, quick time events, and the like. So it's always about how you can spin that console. But with AI, you sit there, you're not devouring the game, you're savoring the moment. You're reflecting, you're not reacting. It requires a different kind of cleverness and agility. So when you're using AI, you can use it for the visuals to bring in nuances and layers. You can use it in branching, or you can use it with NPCs to guide and you have to do all this while it's challenging because you're trying to balance emotion, facts, and ethics all into one. You don't want to be exploitative. You don't want to belittle somebody's suffering. And few people have suffered the way Elsie Steppa suffered. It is so unique that few people can understand what it meant to be her in the last 15 years of her life when she retired, and it should have been where she had relaxation and leisure. She was not married. She didn't have children. But then something happened and she was saddled with her nephew, who was a handful at the best of times. She couldn't do what she wanted. There was a secret, and it was a promise. So she had so much that she had to balance, and she didn't make it at the end. So how do you tell this story? Yes, it's about Elsie and Harry, but more on the side of Elsie. Although she is a holder of a secret, she is not the secret in and of herself. And that was something I really had to contend with. How do you do this woman justice? How do you bring her story to the forefront? Because a lot of people think, well, she's elderly, she's peculiar, she's from a small Canadian town. And yet there's a lot to unpack about this very textured human being who had to live much more in difficult circumstances than she deserved. You try to do the right thing and it ends up ending your life. You try to do right by your family and it ends up being a total tragedy, a total unnecessary mess. So you have emotions here. There's sadness here. There's outrage. There's apathy that brings this, but you don't want to get too bogged down in negative emotions while you're making something like this. You want people to understand. You don't want people to drown in those emotions. So there's a balance of that. And what facts can tell this story where you understand the mystery, the case, and you understand why these pieces have been presented? Because with any true crime story, whether it's in book form or a podcast or a documentary, there's things that have to be left out because police files can be thousands of pages. You cannot put all those thousands of pages on a screen. You can access them in different ways with AI, but not in the traditional sense of when you watch an episode. You have to add the facts and the detail in the background with the way a person looks or moves or dresses to add to that texture. Facts don't just move the story along, they add depth, they add texture. And with all this, you have to do this ethically. This is one of those genres that people see as pulp, and yet it's not, because there's so much you have to consider about people who've been left behind since neither of them had children and their advanced age. It's not the same. So they were isolated, Harry and Elsie, and they really didn't have anybody. And this is another tragedy. How do you tell a story when there's so few advocates for them now? There is none. They're strangers. And it was interesting because when I did the preliminary research a few years ago for A Time to Kill, you go through obituaries, not just of the victims, but you're looking for other family members. So there were a few family members had passed away since their murder. And there wasn't a single one that ever mentioned either one of them in these obituaries. So you think about how isolated these two people were, that they weren't even remembered posthumously in any of their family's obituaries. This is something that I found utterly fascinating and heartbreaking. So here, ethics to me was first and foremost, because you want these people to be remembered. You want people to understand who they were. So that was how I had to construct this game. This is a way you get a community to understand other people. So Secrets Beyond the Grave is a way it's not salacious. It's understanding the victim from their point of view and not just making them into some sort of cookie cutter smiley face. So with Secrets Beyond the Grave, there's open investigation benefits. You can understand these people better when you interact face to face. So that's all I have to say for myself this week. Next week, I'm going to talk about the very first game I did through Clue IQ, Circle of the Frozen Mind. Hope you enjoyed it. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll talk to you next week. Ta-ta for now.